Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Electrically Alkaline. Today's interview is one that I have been waiting so long to bring to you. It's incredibly important that we speak and that we really become educated on this topic, and that is taxation. Today, I'm bringing an expert named Ron, who is very well versed in this knowledge. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce him to you. And so you can find out more about his background, and then we'll dive into the questions. So Ron, please share with us your background in relation to taxation and what brought you to teach and share on this subject.
My background, I'm an engineer by training, and I've been an entrepreneur for several decades now. And so I've always been, I guess you would call me a conservative, but I wouldn't say that I was really aware of how deep the corruption really ran. And my wake-up call really was the election back in whatever 2020, and particularly the aftermath. And so that was kind of one crack. Crack got bigger and bigger and bigger. And then I started to discover the nature of the fraud. What is the United States, right? What happened in 1861? What is a U.S. citizen? And these kinds of things, and how all of our sovereignty was, we were actually volunteering our sovereignty. We're actually surrendering it in almost all cases. And so that started the multi-year journey. And the reason the reason the universe told me, I should say it this way, and I realized that I needed to focus on taxation, is because for two reasons. First, virtually all of the things that you learn as you're really starting to decode the code, so to speak, actually help you decode all the code. It's all the same, right? The tricks that are used for us to make us surrender our sovereignty are pretty much all the same across the board. So if you can really decode the whole taxation scam, then you can pretty much figure anything out. That's number one. And number two, if I had to pick one topic that affected the most people in the biggest manner, it would be the taxation of our labor, right? Our labor is our most fundamental and sacred form of property, and having that be taxed has just horrible impacts on people's lives and their spirit.
Exactly. And where and when did the idea of taxation come into reality?
Well, I had to sort. Oh, you mean in general, not me, but in general. I mean, taxation's been around, right, for thousands and thousands of years. If you go back and look at how the Babylonian Radanites did all their operations, that's where it all starts. And taxation of labor is a soft form of slavery, serfdom, right? Mm-hmm. So as long as slavery and serfdom have been with us, we've been taxing the labor of the slaves and the serfs, right? Mm-hmm. So you're not a sovereign if you have your labor being taxed.
Yeah, it's so true. Is anyone liable for income tax, and how would I know?
Well, so the first question is, what's income, right? But let's take this. Let's talk about this in a way that's kind of from at the level of fundamental principles. If in order to have an obligation imposed upon you, there has to be clear notice of liability, and that's across the board, taxation, anything. Mm-hmm. So the Supreme Court has ruled on taxing statutes over and over and over and over again, for 100 and some years. And the well-settled rule, they don't even rule on it anymore, right? It's because it's so clear. The well-settled rule in Supreme Court precedent is that there needs to be a clearly and plainly laid liability for an income tax or any tax. So, and I'm just going to make this claim here because I can't prove it, but people can look themselves. So the question is where is the liability statute for income tax, right? So the way that taxing statutes work is there's a tax that's imposed. There's hereby imposed on cigars or on the taxable income or whatever, a certain tax, okay? Then if it's a legitimate taxing statute, so-and-so is liable for the tax so imposed up here, right? So what you need to look for in subtitle A, which is the income tax statute in the Title 26, is where's the liability statute? Like where's Waldo, right? So people have been looking for that for a lot of decades, and no one's found it yet.
So technically, no one is liable for income tax.
Well, if there's no liability statute, then there's no such thing as an income tax. Okay. So what we do know is that in section Title 26 U.S. Code 7851A1A, the income tax that was in the 1939 code was repealed. That was the Public Salary Tax Act. So you can tax the labor of a public servant because that's a privilege, it's not a right. And then that was the code of 1954 that did that. So as of January 1st, 1954, no one, as far as I'm aware, no one's been able to find a liability statute. So if you can find a liability statute, then there's an income tax. If you can't find the liability statute, then there's not an income tax. And that's why the Supreme Court in Flora versus United States, that was in 1958, said income we have in our system of taxation. This was an income tax case. Voluntary assessment and payment. It's not based on distraint. It means it can't be coerced, right? So those two things go together. If there is no such thing as an income tax, meaning there's no liability statute, then that's why it would be voluntary, right? So people have to do their own due diligence. I'm not an advisor, tax advisor, financial advisor, accountant, any of that stuff. So people will have to do their own due diligence, and I actually take them through how to do that in some of my other videos.
And are you required to file a tax return? Why or why not?
Well, again, there has to be a clearly and plainly laid obligation for you to file an income tax. And so the question then would be in the return section, which is Title 26 U.S. Code 6001, 6011, and 6012, right? What is the obligation there for you to file an income tax? And again, I can't get into advice here, but you can look at those, right? So 6001, 6011 state very clearly in the statute itself that those people who are liable for a tax have to file a return. So if you're not liable, then you're not have to do it, right? 6012 is a little bit more complicated, and it gets into words, and it gets into enforcing regulations and things like that. So it's a little bit complicated to go into here, but in my course, I go into that in great depth.
I think that definitely points to the difference between citizens and men and women. You know, citizens might, because they sign up under this fraudulent kind of federal corporate government structure, that they're agreeing to these laws that are set in place. But as a man or a woman, a free man or a woman on the land, you know, it's like, show me where I agreed to this.
Well, it's exactly right. It's you know, the Constitution uses the term citizen, and I think if you're right, we need to be clear what the citizen means, because it can mean many different things depending upon the situation in which it's used. So if you want to understand what citizen means in the Constitution, you would need to look at Webster's 1828, right? Which it's online, you can find that. And I have no issue with the term citizen as it's used in the Constitution, but it's used elsewhere, right? Statutory citizens and so on and so forth. So it turns out one of the things that you want to look at, and it's also what matters, is a citizen of what? Right? United States can mean 3 or 4 different things.
Yeah.
So if you can be a citizen of the United States and a citizen of the United States, and those are like black and white. Right?
Yeah, which one are you talking about?
Talking about, right? Are you talking about the states united, or are you talking about federal territory? And that's actually probably the most fundamental way in which we allow ourselves to be tricked. And notice who I'm blaming for being tricked, right? It's our fault, right? If we're sovereigns, and we need to take responsibility for our own actions. So if we don't understand what the term United States is, and therefore we don't understand what the term citizen of the United States means, we can be volunteering for all kinds of things when we're not otherwise obligated to do that.
Article 1, Section 10 of the USA 1789-1791 Constitution prohibits states from using anything but actual gold and silver coin as tender and payment of debt. So how do they tax you in Federal Reserve notes? Federal Reserve notes are defined as obligations in 18 U.S.C. 8 and 31 U.S.C. 3124 prohibits states from taxing federal obligations except for corporations. So if a U.S. citizen or resident alien can be taxed in Federal Reserve notes, then they are a United States corporation / U.S. citizen. A state citizen is not. and no unconstitutional tax can be levied against a state citizen, and Congress has no authority over state citizens. Since many across this nation have figured out this citizenship fraud and are correcting the fraud via passport status correction, the enemy is in panic. The IRS has the right to inquire about taxes if you cannot provide state citizenship. Unless the defendant can prove he is not a citizen of the United States, the IRS has the right to inquire and determine a tax liability. That's U.S. versus Slater, 545.
Are you an employee or employer liable for employment taxes?
Well, again, what does that mean, right? What does employment mean? So all of these words, the key thing, if people take nothing else away from this, you cannot read statute, code, regulations, all that stuff as if it's everyday English, right? It's all words of art, terms of art, canons of construction, and it's called code for a reason, right? It's code. You have to decode the code. Mm-hmm. So employment can mean two different things. Employment can be common law employment, just in general, which relates to the authority hierarchy between the person who's paying you, hiring you, and you when you're providing personal services. Or it can mean a very particular thing in statute, and that's defined at Title 26, 3121A and B, right? So, people will have to do their own due diligence. We spend several hours on this in my course because it's not a straightforward thing. You have to decode the code. But generally speaking, employment happens in, drum roll, United States. Well, what's United States? So 3121E defines United States and its enforcing regulations for 3121E, and the United States looks a lot like federal territory to me, right? So you can tax labor in federal territory because federal territory after Downs versus Bidwell in 1901 doesn't have constitutional protections necessarily. But in the states of the Union, right, we have constitutional protections, and there cannot be a direct tax on state citizens under the Constitution. And employment taxes would be a direct tax.
What is federal territorial jurisdiction, and why does it matter?
It's the most foundational thing. We have to understand what United States means. So in Hooven and Allison in 1945, the Supreme Court said United States can mean three different things. And the two that matter to us here, it can mean the states united, which are the 50 states of the Republican states, not the corporate states. Or it can mean federal territory. It's DC, Guam, Puerto Rico, and so on and so forth. Right? And federal territories within states of the Union. So you have to understand why that's everything. And why I spend so much time on that is once you understand that, you understand that the Constitution protects the 50 states of the Union, but not federal territory. You realize how they get away with all of everything they're doing. Everything. Because they say it applies in the United States. Well, what does that mean? Right? And that there's all kinds of other complications there too that have to do with the Buck Act and the corporate states. Those are federal territorial states and so on and so forth. But that's the essential issue.
What does the 16th Amendment really mean?
Well, the 16th Amendment doesn't create any new taxation. The Supreme Court's been very clear on that. People can take a look at the Brush-Haber case and whenever that is, I can't remember. It clarifies that you can tax sources. And your labor is not a source. A source would be a privilege in the United States, like manufacturing alcohol or manufacturing guns or importing cigarettes and things like that. Those are excise taxes. And there's 20 or 30 different legitimate liability statutes for excise taxes on all kinds of stuff that are privileges, right? But your labor in states of the Union is not a privilege, it's a right. It's your property.
How do you reach an agreement with the IRS?
Everything is administrative process. So, and again, it's a little bit complicated to get into here in detail, but essentially, write them a letter, right? Say, hey, this is what I think, and if you disagree with me, let me know, and if you don't, then I'll know you agree with me. You send them a reminder and send them another reminder, and then you put it on the public record. And there's a formal way to do that. And again, I can't give advice. I'm just, this is for education, entertainment purposes only, right? I'm not an advisor, but I've done something like that, and it seems to work pretty well.
Yeah, in one of your videos on BitChute that I was watching, you show an example of a letter of pretty much inquiry to your tax advisor saying, hey, show me where the liability is, like you were speaking about in the beginning.
Think about this. Pretty much everybody hires a certified public accountant to do their taxes. And most of those CPAs, and some who are not CPAs, are IRS enrolled agents. That's a privilege to practice before the Bureau. And so they determine what your tax liability is, right? So the letter you could ask them, and this is actually the problem, because we don't take responsibility for our own liabilities. We outsource that, and we get bad advice, I think. And people can determine for themselves. They'll see if they write that letter or a letter like that, what response they'll get. But they have to be prepared for being fired as a client, which answers the question, right? Why would your CPA fire you as a client, not want to do business for you, if you simply ask the question, what statute have you relied upon all these years to determine my liability, the stuff that I have to pay for this thing called income tax?
For those of you watching, if you do feel inspired to, from your own will, to send that letter to your tax advisor, please let me know how that goes. I would love to hear feedback on that. Maybe we'll do a part 2 to this interview.
Have a montage, right, of all the different responses, right?
Yeah.
So when I sent mine, I got fired.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I can't work for you. You're involved in you may be involved in fraud. It's like, well, that's called projection, right?
Well, for asking a question.
That's
yeah.
right.
It says a lot.
Yeah, it says a lot. And now that when people will have to decide for themselves, right? They may have been defrauded, right? So it's they have a if you agree, and I'm not saying that this is true, but if you agree that tax preparers have a fiduciary duty to you, and they fail in that duty of care or duty of loyalty, then that's actually actionable, and people can decide what they want to do with that.
So how do you know if an IRS form is voluntary or mandatory?
I think it may be Title 44, 3512. It has to have a valid OMB number. And how do you know it has a valid OMB number? Well, it has to say clearly. Again, there always has to be clear notice of liability. So if they send you a form, say, here, fill this out, then it has to say voluntary or mandatory. And if it's mandatory, they have to provide the statute that makes it mandatory, so then you can actually go look for yourself to determine if that applies to you or if it's truly mandatory. So let's do a thought experiment, right? If it doesn't do that, right? If it were truly a voluntary form, would the IRS say voluntary in big red letters on the top?
No.
Right. If it were mandatory, would they say mandatory in big red letters on the top?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So look, if it doesn't say anything, what do you think that means? If it's true, right? If that's true, and people that goes back, and again, I can't give advice. People have to do their own homework, but my research indicates that goes back to the Paperwork Reduction Act and the Privacy Act and things like that. And there's very clear statutes in Title V CFR about and regulations that say exactly what the agency has to put on all their forms.
This is an incredibly useful gem I'm about to share with you, and that's 26 CFR 6011B 2C6 provides that employers are not required to ask prospective employees for a Social Security number, but instead suggest that an employer should ask. So many of us believe that we have to be providing Social Security numbers to get a job, and this code clearly lays out that it is to be suggested. 26 CFR 31.3402P1 explains that the Form W-4 is a voluntary withholding agreement, and its completion is not required by law. In general, an employee and his employer may enter into an agreement under Section 3402B. Notice that it's may and not must. If you have submitted a W-4 form, I want to let you know that there is a W-4T form, which is a voluntary withholding agreement termination or withdrawal form. So this is the form that you can use to terminate the W-4 form you filled out. You'll see the code below as well. Make sure to look into that for the voluntary withholding agreements.
Those whole Supreme Court cases, the essence of the case is what a shall mean, right? So they use words like shall and must all the time because they need a word that can mean imperative, mandatory in federal territory, but permissive, right, voluntary in the states of the union. So these are, again, you can't read code like it's everyday English because it's code. You have to decode the code, and shall and must are terms of art in statutory construction.
How do you know if a statute applies to you?
Well, the first question is where's the what territory does it apply in? And almost all of these statutes, whether they're state or federal, are actually only apply in federal territory, and you can you can find that out. That has to do with most of the state statutes are apply in this state or within this state, and that's federal territory. But the second way you can do it is you can, under the Federal Register Act, every single statute has to have an enforcing regulation, and the enforcing regulation has to be published, and has to be a substantive published regulation in the Federal Register. So that, again, that takes a little bit of explaining to people, but by and large, you can, with the tax statutes, for example, they almost all apply only in Title 27. Well, what's Title 27? Alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. Those are privileges, and none of them essentially apply. If you look, you'll find out none of them apply in Part 1, which is income taxes.
It's just that basic understanding. It's like we have to remember that we have a say what we choose to contract with and what to not contract with. So just because some foreign entity imposes these restrictions and different types of legal rules, acts, and statutes, mandates, ordinances, you never agree to it. So if you really are a free man and a free woman, you have say in the matter. I think that's really important for people to really understand and to start exercising, especially in these times now with, everything with the masks and vaccine. I can't even say that word on YouTube anymore.
Right. I agree with you. It is in our country, I think, black letter law, explicit black letter law, that men and women in 50 states of the Union, right, so that United States, are the sovereigns. And that's in the Declaration of Independence, the first two sentences in the second paragraph. That's black letter law. Wicchio versus Hopkins, Chisholm versus Georgia, Marion versus Jicarilla Apache tribe. The Supreme Court has gone over this over and over and over and over again. So that is the principle. I agree with you. I've found that to be it's important to know that and to understand that that's the truth, but it's not always the most effective argument to make. So if you find yourself, for example, getting a notice from one of these agencies, it's better to know some of these other things, because that's a better way to not consent, right? Is to know their rules and use their rules against them.
Exactly. Yeah, you have more tools in your toolbox to use.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's the principle and there's the practice. And I think it's important to know both.
And the spiritual, which we will be getting into as well.
That too. Yeah, exactly.
What is a common fatal flaw with typical IRS notices?
Oh, there's lots of them. I mean, one of them I can't call it a client. So it's a friend of mine just got, right? A friend of mine just got one. At the top it says request for information. So we wrote a letter back. It's called the conditional acceptance. Well, gee, now it says request for information. Now, is this a request, to which my response is voluntary, or is it a demand with nice language that I have to respond to? We never heard back. So apparently it was voluntary, and if we say if it's voluntary, we don't consent, right? So yeah, so that's one of them. They're all voluntary, but then a lot of them also they'll cite a statute, but they'll never cite the enforcing regulation. And so if you know how to go look what the enforcing regulation is, you can do a notice of conditional acceptance. Hey, I'm happy to respond to this, But according to this statute applies for alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, Title 27, according to the Federal Register Act, and blah, blah, blah. So what evidence do you have that I'm engaged in a privileged activity regulated by Title 27? Right. And if you have some, let me know. And if you don't, I don't consent. Right.
I love that. Yeah.
It's a very honorable way to do it. The best way to do these things, I mean, affidavits have their place, and I do use affidavits, but the best way to do this is to know what question to ask that they can't answer.
Mm-hmm.
And this is also why it's so imperative that people self-govern. You can't outsource. Kings and queens, they have advisors, yeah, but they don't really outsource in the end, right? They're responsible for their own actions. You can't outsource this. These attorneys, these CPAs, they do not know the law. I've seen this over and over and over and over and over again. Go ask it. Go be my guest. You do the experiment. Go ask an attorney what the Federal Register Act is and how would you use it. See what happens.
Yeah. Yeah, many attorneys don't even know what the bar stands for. So the British Accreditation Registry. Yeah, that says a lot. So what are the spiritual implications of paying tax?
When your labor, again, which is your most sacred form of property and the foundation for all of your other property, when that's being taxed, you are, in fact, not what you're supposed to be. You're a divine creation. You are a sovereign on the land. You're subject only to the authority of your creator. So if you are consenting and volunteering to have your labor tax, you're basically consenting to be a slave and a serf. And I think that has horrible spiritual implications. It really degrades people and doesn't allow them to be who they're supposed to be.
Absolutely. I think that this is such a vital component of really shifting into the reality that we all dream of creating so badly. It's like, you can't get that far when you've got 1 foot in and 1 foot out, and you're still feeding this beast and this corruption. So it's like, of course, your energy and what you put your energy into is a vote towards what you want to create in your world. So that's why I really want everyone who is paying tax, and of course, it's going to be coming from what is right for you in your own truth, really look into these laws, look into these statutes, really take some time to research and understand these definitions and these codes. And it will help you to make a decision that is empowering and that doesn't feel disempowering, that you're having to do from a place of fear and intimidation. That's another thing. If, like, for me, when I see the taxation happening, I see the government acting no different than a mafia. It's like, oh, okay, this is my labor that I worked so hard for, and now you're knocking on my door and you're demanding a percentage of it to fund something that I don't agree with, something that I don't want to put my money into. And now if I don't give this to you, you're basically going to threaten me and throw me in jail. And especially if I have children and a family that I need to support and take care of, I mean, you're really putting the individual in an impossible situation. So because these individuals, they don't know, all of the code, they don't know the proper words, and then many times they'll incriminate themselves without knowing by using the improper words. Unfortunately, I've seen a lot of good intended people end up getting reprimanded, going to jail, and all of these horrible things. So that's why the knowledge and the education, it's absolutely vital to set the foundation properly to then build upon that. Yeah. And with that being said, I would love, Ron, if you can share how people can get in touch with you and share about any upcoming classes that you may have if people want to dive in. I'm personally going to be taking your class that's coming up, so I look forward to learning more.
That's good. Well, yeah, we do have a couple of course offerings, and I'm also putting out free videos, little snippets, sound bites on Wednesdays and Sundays, most Wednesdays, most Sundays. Because again, we have to look at the world with fresh eyes. So those are an opportunity for me on a regular basis to get 5, 10, 15-minute sound bites out there. Like, okay, this is what I see here, right? So my Sunday sound bites are a little bit longer, and they get into more educational in the sense I'm actually laying out a curriculum to teach people, like, what is United States, what is black letter law regarding sovereignty? Is that just a right-wing conspiracy theory, or is it a black letter law? What does that mean? What's the difference between the States United and United States? Why is Downs versus Bidwell so important? How do you interpret, includes all kinds of things, right? And then the Wednesday ones are like things I come across. Hey, I came across this. I look at this. Now this is let's decode this, right? So we actually decode things kind of in real time. And those we just put the first one out. And I'm trying to be a little bit irreverent in there because one of the things I found, and maybe you can help me with this, because I'm 29, right? So, but I still can't. I don't seem to connect with. For some reason, we're having a really hard time connecting with the 20s and 30 somethings, right? Most of the people who are coming to this, whether it's my energy or it's the topic or whatever, are quite a bit older, and I would love to get a younger audience because they've got their whole life in front of them and they can actually make changes now that they can benefit from for decades, and their families can benefit from even before they've started a family, right? So that's one thing that's free, and that's on YouTube, and I'll give you the links for those. You can put those in your description here. And then the courses, I teach one course on what does it mean to be a state national or a state citizen versus a federal territorial citizen, and why does it matter, and how do you clarify that if you are concerned about that. That's kind of a foundational level course, and that one of the benefits of that course is it also begins to teach people about paperwork, right? It's all administrative process. How do you send a notice? What are the different kinds of notices? How do you do registered mail? How do you follow up? How do you record something? What's an affidavit?
Yeah.
It's this basic blocking and tackling that nobody basically knows, right? Because we've been dumbed down for all these generations. And then there's a more advanced class that's called Decode the Code. Now that class happens to focus mostly on the federal tax code, a little bit on the state, but it's really not about that. That's a teaching tool. And I call it Decode the Code because that's what we're doing. We're decoding code. I'm teaching people how to decode code. And we get into the Paperwork Reduction Act, Federal Register Act. These are very simple things in the end. And it's once you get it, it's like a hot knife through butter for almost everything. But you need to be taught it. And so that's why I do it that way. And my whole goal there is to enable people to be who they're supposed to be, which are sovereigns.
And when is that happening? Decode the Code.
Well, the next one is first 2 weekends in March, I think, and then I have another one later on in April. And so every couple of months I do another one, and we have I do this it's kind of a de minimis price and a very small class size because I want people to have individual attention and get their questions answered. And I do it over Zoom now, so it's nationwide.
Well, I just want to thank you so much for coming on and for sharing such important, valuable knowledge with all of us. And for everyone, I'm going to be leaving his links below, and you can feel free to reach out to him and to sign up to Decode the Code. I will be there, so hopefully I will see you there.
I'm going to share with you some case law. Keeping in mind the well-settled rule that the citizen is exempt from taxation unless the same is imposed by a clear and unequivocal language, and that where the construction of a tax law is doubtful, the doubt is to be resolved in favor of those upon whom the tax is sought to be laid. That's Spreckels Sugar Refining versus McLean. Our system of income taxation is based upon voluntary assessment and payment, not distraint. This is Flora versus the United States. If you found this interview to be useful and informative, please do share it with your friends, your family, and on your social media to really share and spread the awareness about these codes that once decoded mean something completely different. Also, if you haven't yet checked out my private members association, I'll leave a link for you below at oxnelia.org. Joining is free, and once you join, you will gain access to products and services like chemtrail mitigation, tons of knowledge about Vedic astrology, spirituality, how to literally clear chemtrails within a 15 to 30 mile radius with chembusters, sovereign knowledge cores, creating your own God trust. It really is a wealth of knowledge on the website. So feel free to check it out. And I'm sending you all so many divine blessings. And until the next video.